I had always believed with a steadfast, almost sacred conviction that bordered on the naively romantic in the enduring, unshakable power of love, the profound sanctity of family, and the quiet, almost tangible security that I thought emanated from unwavering mutual trust. For nearly 2 decades, a significant defining portion of my adult life, I, Elena Ramirez, had poured every ounce of my heart, every fiber of my soul, my very essence into meticulously, lovingly building what I genuinely, blissfully, and as it would soon be, devastatingly revealed to my core, entirely erroneously perceived to be a perfect, almost idyllic life. It was a life carefully, almost artistically, woven with the shimmering golden threads of shared dreams, of unwavering, unquestioning loyalty, and of a deep, abiding, and I had so fervently, so completely believed, entirely reciprocal, all-encompassing love. My husband, Richard Miller, was in my admittedly biased, and as it turned out with such crushing finality, tragically clouded eyes, and indeed in the admiring, often openly envious eyes of most who knew him, in our outwardly prosperous suburban community, the very epitome of the devoted, loving husband, the successful, astute, and entirely dependable provider, the engaged, patient, and wonderfully playful, almost idolized father. We had met in the halcyon, sun-drenched, hopeful days of our final year of college. He, the charming, undeniably handsome, and fiercely, almost restlessly ambitious business major, with a quick, engaging, almost dazzling smile, and an even quicker, more impressive, and often intimidatingly sharp mind. I, the slightly more reserved, introspective, and perhaps incurably romantic art history student, captivated almost instantly, almost irrevocably, by his boundless, infectious energy, his unwavering, almost arrogant self-confidence, and his persuasive, almost intoxicating vision of a shared, glittering, and entirely secure future. Our courtship had been a whirlwind, a classic, almost cinematic storybook romance. Or so it had always seemed to me, filled with stolen, breathless kisses under starlit summer skies, with long, meandering, soul-bearing conversations that stretched late into the pre-dawn hours with a shared, palpable, almost electric sense of excitement and joyful anticipation for the wonderful, adventure-filled life we were so confidently, so eagerly, and so naively planning to build together. We married a year after graduation, a beautiful, sun-drenched, flower-filled, almost fairy tale-like ceremony, held in my parents' rambling, picturesque country garden, a day filled with heartfelt, tearful, and entirely sincere vows, with the joyful, unrestrained, and heartfelt blessings of our assembled, beaming families, and with my own almost unbearable, almost suffocating sense of profound, unshakable, and utterly complete happiness. Richard's career in the competitive, high-stakes, and often ruthless world of corporate finance took off with an almost meteoric and deeply, genuinely impressive speed. He was undeniably brilliant, strategically astute, relentlessly driven, and possessed an almost preternatural, uncanny ability to network effortlessly to charm even the most hardened, cynical of business associates to close complex multi-million-dollar deals with an air of casual, almost nonchalant aplomb that both amazed and, I confess, sometimes slightly intimidated me. I, in turn, with a sense of loving duty and a genuine desire to support his burgeoning, demanding career, willingly, almost eagerly, and with very little internal debate or regret, at the time, set aside my own nascent, more modest career aspirations. My own small, independent interior design consultancy, a venture I had poured so much of my creative energy and passion into during my final year of college and the first year of our marriage, a business that had shown early promising, if not yet spectacular, signs of genuine success, was gently, lovingly, but with a certain undeniable finality, placed on indefinite hold as I embraced with a full, open, and entirely committed heart the all-consuming and, in those early idyllic days, deeply, profoundly fulfilling roles of devoted wife, meticulous homemaker, and soon thereafter adoring and often utterly exhausted mother. Our 2 children, Olivia, now a bright, perceptive, and occasionally far too knowing 16-year-old with my own artistic sensibilities and her father's sharp analytical wit, and young Daniel, a boisterous, sports-mad, and endearingly goofy 13-year-old whose infectious, unrestrained laughter could and often did fill our entire home with an almost tangible, effervescent joy, were quite simply the radiant twin suns around which my entire universe lovingly, willingly, and with an almost sacred, unwavering devotion revolved. Their happiness, their well-being, their future security became the sole, all-encompassing focus of my existence. Our home, a spacious, gracefully aging, and I believed deeply loved colonial, nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street in one of the city's more established, affluent, and highly sought-after suburban neighborhoods, was more than just a house. It was our sanctuary, our haven, a tangible testament to our shared journey, our family's history, a repository of our most cherished, most precious collective memories. I had poured countless hours and a significant, almost entirety of a substantial inheritance left to me by my beloved far-sighted grandmother into transforming it from a somewhat neglected, slightly rambling, but structurally sound older structure into a warm, inviting, aesthetically beautiful, and impeccably well-organized haven for my family. Every room, every corner bore the unmistakable, loving imprint of my creative touch. The carefully chosen harmonious color palettes that shifted subtly with the changing seasons. The comfortable antique store-find furnishings lovingly, painstakingly restored with my own two hands. The vibrant original artwork, much of it my own, from my premarital, more creatively unencumbered design days, supplemented now by Olivia's own burgeoning, impressive portfolio adorning the sun-drenched walls. The sprawling, meticulously tended, sun-dappled backyard with its riot of fragrant prize-winning roses I nurtured with an almost maternal obsessive devotion, its ancient, majestic tire-swing-adorned oak tree that served as the silent, steadfast sentinel of countless childhood adventures, and its slightly ramshackle but much-loved multi-level treehouse. Daniel and his father had supposedly collaboratively built together one long-ago golden summer. Though even then, I had harbored a sneaking, uncharitable suspicion that Richard's primary contribution had been largely supervisory, a dispenser of tools and unsolicited advice. A fact that now, in the harsh, unforgiving light of retrospect, pricked at my memory with a new, unwelcome, and deeply unsettling significance, was the beloved, oft-used scene of countless happy, boisterous family barbecues, of elaborately themed, joyfully chaotic children's birthday parties, and of quiet, contemplative, and deeply cherished Sunday afternoons spent reading in the dappled, shifting sunlight, the gentle hum of bees in the nearby lavender bushes, a soothing, somnolent soundtrack to our peaceful domestic bliss. This house, this home, was not just a significant financial asset, a valuable piece of real estate in an increasingly desirable location. It was, I believed with every fiber of my being, the very heart, the irreplaceable soul of our family, the physical, tangible embodiment of our shared love, our hard-won security, our most precious, most cherished dreams for the future. And I, its primary caretaker, its loving curator, its devoted custodian, cherished it with an intensity, a passion, that bordered on the reverent. And I, Elena Ramirez, was not just the dedicated, unpaid, and largely unacknowledged caretaker of this idyllic domestic sphere. I had always firmly and with a certain quiet internal pride believed an active, valued, and entirely respected partner in our family's overall financial well-being in the strategic planning for our shared secure future. While Richard, with his high-powered, lucrative career in finance, was undeniably and quite visibly the primary breadwinner, the one whose impressive salary afforded us our comfortable, even affluent lifestyle, I, too, had contributed significantly, consistently, and often in ways that were less immediately apparent, but no less crucial to our family's financial stability and growth. The substantial inheritance from my grandmother, a sum accumulated through her own lifetime of frugal living and shrewd, if small-scale investments, had not only provided the entire significant down payment for our beautiful Maple Street home, allowing us to enter the then booming property market at an advantageous time, but had also, under what I had for nearly 2 decades, trustingly, unquestioningly, and as it now seemed with a naivete that bordered on the criminally foolish, believed to be Richard's astute expert financial guidance, been subsequently strategically invested in a diversified and supposedly appreciating portfolio of other smaller residential properties, a few carefully selected blue-chip stocks, and some long-term interest-bearing municipal bonds. All of these assets Richard had repeatedly lovingly and with an air of almost paternalistic solicitude assured me were held securely and were growing steadily in my own name, as a clear, unequivocal testament to his profound love, his unwavering respect for my financial contribution, and his absolute unshakable commitment to our shared equitable and entirely transparent financial future. "This is your personal nest egg, Elena darling," he would often say, his voice laced with that familiar disarming, and as I now realized entirely fraudulent warmth. His arm draped casually, proprietarily, almost possessively, around my shoulders as he gestured towards a neatly printed and, as it turned out, entirely fabricated investment summary he'd just received from Westwood Financial. "Your independent security, our children's unshakable legacy, something entirely separate, entirely insulated from my own more, shall we say, volatile and sometimes necessarily aggressive business investments. Something safe, something solid, something utterly unshakable, something that will always, always be there for you. For Olivia, for Daniel, no matter what unforeseen storms life might perversely choose to throw our way. And I fool that I was blinded by love, by trust, by nearly 2 decades of shared history, by the comfortable, insidious complacency of a seemingly perfect, entirely secure married life, had believed him, implicitly, utterly, completely. Why in God's name, why would I not? He was my husband, my partner, the father of my children, the man with whom I had willingly, joyfully, and with an open, trusting heart pledged to share my entire life, my dreams, my deepest vulnerabilities for better, for worse, in sickness and in health until death did us part. The very idea, the monstrous, unthinkable, almost sacrilegious notion that he, my Richard, my rock, my supposed soulmate, could ever, in any conceivable universe, under any imaginable circumstance, deliberately, systematically, and with such cold, calculated cruelty deceive me, betray me, particularly in matters as sacred, as fundamental, as intrinsically vital to our family's well-being, our children's future as our shared financial security, our jointly held, lovingly accumulated assets, was simply unthinkable, unfathomable, a grotesque, alien, and entirely impossible concept that had absolutely no place, no purchase, no conceivable reality in the carefully constructed, deeply cherished, and as I was about to discover with a swiftness and brutality that would steal the very breath from my lungs, entirely damnably illusory reality of my seemingly perfect, idyllically happy, and soon-to-be catastrophically shattered married life. His family, the Millers, his stern, somewhat aloof, but generally perceived as benign father, a retired and highly respected surgeon. His impeccably dressed, socially ambitious, and often rather intimidatingly formidable mother, Patricia, a woman who always seemed to be chairing some important charity committee or another, and his 2 younger, perpetually squabbling, and in my private, often uncharitable opinion, rather spoiled and self-absorbed adult siblings, a brother Stephen, a perpetually between-ventures entrepreneur, and a sister Caroline, a thrice-divorced socialite with a penchant for expensive spa treatments and even more expensive gossip, had always, I believed, or perhaps more accurately, had always hoped held me in a certain, if perhaps somewhat reserved and occasionally critical affection. Or at least they had maintained a consistent, if sometimes strained facade of grudging, if not entirely enthusiastic acceptance. I was, after all, the devoted and, by all accounts, highly competent wife who kept their precious, high-achieving Richard happy, well-fed, impeccably turned out, and entirely free to pursue his relentless wealth-generating career ambitions. I was more importantly the mother of their beloved and by all accounts well-adjusted and successful grandchildren, Olivia and Daniel. While Patricia Miller, my mother-in-law, had in the early, more vulnerable years of our marriage occasionally, and with a surgeon's precision, made a few subtle, almost imperceptible, yet nonetheless deeply wounding comments that hinted at a certain disappointment that Richard hadn't perhaps married someone from a more established, more financially advantageous, or perhaps simply more socially prominent Soda background than my own humble middle-class art historian-turned-homemaker origins, I had largely and perhaps foolishly dismissed these as the typical, harmless if sometimes irritating anxieties of a fiercely protective and undeniably snobbish mother. Over the long intervening years, our relationship, or so I had convinced myself, had settled into a comfortable, if not deeply intimate or genuinely warm pattern of polite, if sometimes slightly strained familial obligation, of shared, often ostentatious holiday dinners at their grand ancestral home, of dutiful, if somewhat perfunctory, birthday celebrations of the occasional carefully orchestrated and usually rather tedious formal family gathering. There had never, to my knowledge, been any overt, undeniable hostility, any significant, memorable conflict, any truly alarming, red flag-waving reason for me to suspect that beneath their veneer of cool, upper-middle-class, almost Brahmin-like civility, there lurked any deeper, more insidious, or more malevolent intentions towards me, or, more specifically, and as it would soon be devastatingly revealed, towards the not inconsiderable financial assets I so trustingly, so naively, so disastrously believed were securely, unequivocally, and entirely mine. The first, almost laughably innocuous, yet in chilling, devastating retrospect, so deeply, cruelly significant harbinger of the impending life-altering storm, arrived not as a dramatic Hollywood-esque thunderclap of sudden, shocking revelation, but as a series of small, seemingly inconsequential, and at the time, entirely, almost reassuringly, easily rationalized administrative requests from Richard. It was about 18 long, blissful, and entirely unsuspecting months prior to my eventual horrifying, world-shattering discovery. He had come home from his imposing downtown office one crisp autumn evening, looking, I now recall, with a painful, retroactive, and utterly useless clarity, just a fraction more stressed, a little more preoccupied, a little more intense than his usual, already quite intense end-of-a-long workday demeanor, though of course he had, with his customary practiced and entirely believable air of weary masculine martyrdom, brushed off my concerned wifely inquiries with his standard dismissive, just another incredibly demanding high-pressure day at the firm, darling. Millions at stake. You know how it is. Absolutely nothing for you to worry your pretty little and wonderfully artistic head about. Later that same evening, as we were tidying up the remnants of our shared family dinner, as Olivia was animatedly recounting the latest dramatic developments in her high school art club, and Daniel was attempting with a singular lack of success to explain the arcane offside rule in soccer to a bemused but patiently listening Buster, our aging golden retriever Richard casually, almost as an entirely inconsequential afterthought, produced a slim, unassuming manila folder from his expensive Italian leather briefcase. The folder, I now recall with a sickening lurch of my stomach, was filled with what appeared to be dense, jargon-filled, and entirely incomprehensible legal documents. Elena, sweetheart, he'd said, his voice a little too breezy, a little too nonchalant, his usually so charming smile perhaps a fraction too bright, a little too forced, a little too salesman-like. There are just a few, very minor, entirely routine, administrative papers here that the firm's lawyers bless their meticulous, billable hour-obsessed souls need your signature on. Something rather tedious to do with restructuring some of our older, less tax-efficient property investments, streamlining the ownership structures for better estate planning. You know, the usual mind-numbing, but unfortunately entirely necessary corporate boilerplate. It'll apparently, or so they assure me, with great and very expensive conviction, save us a considerable, truly significant amount in capital gains taxes down the line, and will also, they claim, make things much simpler, much more straightforward for you and the children should Should anything ever, God forbid, happen to me. All perfectly standard, entirely prudent, and really quite boring procedure, darling. Just a few quick, entirely painless signatures here on this page and here on this one. And just one more here if you wouldn't mind, sweetheart. It'll only take a moment of your precious creative time. I remember with a clarity that now feels like a physical, almost brutal blow, glancing briefly, almost dismissively, at the thick, intimidating sheaf of papers he held out to me, my eyes glazing over almost instantly at the dense, impenetrable, almost alien wall of convoluted legalese, at the complex, bewildering diagrams of interconnected corporate entities and numbered companies I didn't recognize, had never even heard of, at the unfamiliar, almost aggressively obscure financial terminology that seemed designed more to obfuscate than to clarify. I had always, I confess, with a deep abiding and now entirely self-recriminating shame, possessed a certain intellectual laziness, a profound, almost willful and entirely inexcusable disinterest when it came to the more arcane, more tedious, and in my then naive perception, entirely masculine complexities of high finance, of corporate law, of estate planning. My domain, I had always comfortably, perhaps even smugly believed, was the home, the heart, the nurturing of souls, the cultivation of beauty, the creation of a loving, harmonious domestic environment. His Richard's was the harsh, competitive, and entirely mystifying world of numbers of contracts of strategic wealth-generating financial maneuvering. I had so foolishly, so disastrously, so completely believed a perfectly balanced, entirely complementary, and mutually respectful partnership. So I didn't question it. Not really. Not with any genuine probing curiosity. Not with any degree of healthy warranted skepticism. I didn't scrutinize the dense, jargon-filled, and undoubtedly critically important pages with the meticulous attention to detail I would have unreservedly applied to choosing a new fabric swatch for the living room curtains, or to proofreading one of Olivia's English essays. I simply took the expensive gold-plated fountain pen he so casually, so confidently offered me, and with a trusting, almost perfunctory smile, a smile that now in my memory twists itself into a grotesque, mocking grimace of my own, breathtaking, almost criminal naivete, I signed, where he so clearly, so precisely, so helpfully indicated, line after line, page after page. It seemed at the time like such a minor, such an inconsequential, such an entirely routine domestic act. An act of wifely trust, an act of marital partnership. All done. My efficient little angel, he'd asked, his voice laced with that familiar, indulgent, and as I now realized, so deeply, so poisonously condescending affection. He'd scooped up the signed papers with an almost unseemly, almost suspicious haste, before the ink of my own unknowing, devastating self-betrayal was barely, if at all, dry on the page. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Now don't you worry your pretty little and wonderfully artistic head about any of this tedious, boring financial stuff ever again, sweetheart. That's my department, my responsibility, my burden to bear. I'll take care of everything. For us, for our future, for the children. You just focus on making our home beautiful, on raising our wonderful children, on being my amazing, irreplaceable Elena. He had. Then, I recall, with a fresh, almost unbearable surge of nauseating, retroactive horror, leaned down and bestowed upon me a light, lingering, and entirely damnably Judas-like kiss on the cheek, a kiss that had at the time felt like a comforting reassurance. But now, in the harsh, unforgiving glare of my present devastating reality, felt like the cold reptilian seal of his profound, almost unimaginable and entirely unforgivable betrayal. Little did I know then, in that moment of blind unquestioning and ultimately so catastrophic wifely trust, that those careless, unexamined, and so easily, so thoughtlessly appended signatures would mark not just a minor administrative adjustment to our shared financial portfolio, but the catastrophic, life-altering beginning of my worst, most unimaginable nightmare. They were the first insidious and entirely unseen threads in a complex, patiently woven, and utterly devastating web of deceit, a web that would in the fullness of time threaten to not just unravel, but to entirely comprehensively and with a breathtaking, almost sociopathic cruelty, destroy everything I held most dear, everything I had ever worked for, everything I had ever in my foolish, trusting heart believed to be true, to be sacred, to be mine. The perfect life was not just beginning to crack. It was in fact already silently, invisibly, and with a chilling premeditated precision being stolen right out from under me. The months immediately following my casual, unthinking signing of those routine administrative papers unfolded with a deceptive, almost mocking veneer of continued domestic tranquility and marital bliss. Life on Maple Street, at least on the surface, proceeded much as it always had. Olivia, my daughter, navigated the tumultuous, exciting currents of her junior year of high school with her usual blend of artistic flair and academic diligence. Her social calendar a whirlwind of school play rehearsals, art club meetings, and whispered late-night phone calls with her burgeoning circle of friends. Daniel, my son, threw himself with a boundless, boisterous energy into the competitive rigors of middle school soccer. His weekends a blur of muddy cleats, triumphant and occasionally tearful victories and defeats, and an insatiable teenage boy appetite that kept our grocery bills perpetually alarmingly high. And I, Elena, continued in my cherished, if often exhausting role as the steadfast, loving hub of our family wheel, orchestrating the complex, often chaotic logistics of our daily lives with my usual practiced efficiency. A quiet, unassuming smile, and an increasingly, though still largely unacknowledged undercurrent of something. A vague, amorphous, and deeply unsettling disquiet that I couldn't quite name, couldn't quite pinpoint, but which nonetheless began to subtly, insidiously color the periphery of my otherwise contented existence. Richard, my husband, in the immediate aftermath of that fateful document signing, seemed, if anything, almost lighter, more carefree than he had been in months, perhaps even years. The lines of stress that had previously seemed permanently etched around his eyes, the subtle, almost constant tension that had lately characterized his jawline, appeared to have softened, to have eased. He was more attentive, more affectionate, almost reminiscent of the charming, ardent young man I had fallen so deeply in love with all those years ago. He brought home unexpected bouquets of my favorite lilies. He initiated spontaneous, playful tickle fights with the children, his laughter echoing through our home with a warmth and unforced gaiety that had been noticeably painfully absent for far too long. He even, on one particularly memorable, almost surreal Saturday morning, insisted on making breakfast for all of us. A slightly burnt but nonetheless deeply appreciated offering of pancakes and scrambled eggs, a gesture so uncharacteristic, so out of the blue, that it brought tears of surprised, grateful joy to my eyes. I attributed this welcome, if somewhat startling change in his demeanor, to a successful resolution of whatever complex financial restructuring those papers had entailed. He must, I reasoned with a surge of wifely pride and relief, have indeed managed to streamline our assets and save us a considerable amount in capital gains, just as he had so confidently, so reassuringly predicted. Our future, it seemed, was even more secure, even more prosperous than I had previously imagined. The vague, unspoken anxieties about our long-term financial stability. Anxieties that had occasionally in the dead of night pricked at the edges of my own. More cautious maternal consciousness began to recede, replaced by a renewed, if still somewhat fragile sense of optimism, of trust in his undeniable, if sometimes opaque financial acumen. However, as the weeks turned into months, this initial, almost euphoric period of renewed marital harmony began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, at first, then, with a more dawning, uncomfortable clarity, give way to a new and far more troubling set of behavioral shifts in Richard. His periods of almost manic, affectionate attentiveness became interspersed with longer, more frequent episodes of a strange, almost furtive preoccupation. He started spending even more time than usual closeted away in his private home office, the door, which had previously always been left slightly ajar, now often firmly, almost aggressively closed. The sounds emanating from within were not the usual familiar clicks of his keyboard as he worked on architectural blueprints or client proposals, but rather long, hushed, and often rather tense-sounding phone conversations, his voice a low, indecipherable murmur punctuated by occasional sharp, almost angry exclamations that would cease abruptly if I happened to unexpectedly enter the room with a cup of coffee or a query about dinner. His explanations for these increasingly frequent and increasingly secretive calls became more vague, more evasive than ever before. Just a very sensitive, very confidential client matter, darling. He'd say, his eyes not quite meeting mine, his hand often subtly, almost unconsciously shielding the screen of his phone or his laptop from my view. NDA involved. Can't discuss the details even with you, I'm afraid. You understand, of course. The world of high finance, it's a veritable minefield of confidentiality clauses. Or, It's just some rather tedious internal company politics, Elena. Utterly boring. You wouldn't be interested in the slightest. Trust me. And I still clinging desperately to the comforting illusion of our recently rediscovered marital bliss, still basking in the residual glow of his earlier uncharacteristic attentiveness, still so deeply, so foolishly conditioned by nearly 2 decades of unwavering, almost blind trust, would more often than not simply accept his explanations at face value. I would not understandingly offer a sympathetic if slightly forced smile and retreat, leaving him to his sensitive confidential business, chiding myself internally for my own clearly unwarranted and increasingly intrusive wifely curiosity. Then the unexplained and often quite significant financial expenditures began. Or rather, I began to notice them with a new, unwelcome, and deeply unsettling clarity. There was the sudden impulsive purchase of a brand new top-of-the-line and ridiculously expensive imported sports car, a sleek, predatory, jet-black machine that looked entirely, almost comically out of place, parked in the driveway of our comfortable, family-oriented suburban colonial. Richard, when I, with a mixture of genuine bewilderment and a dawning, horrified suspicion, questioned the extravagant and entirely unbudgeted purchase, had waved my concerns away with an airy, almost dismissive nonchalance. Oh, that darling. Just a little treat for myself. A reward for closing that massive Henderson Tower deal last month. Besides, he'd added with a wink and a rather unconvincing self-congratulatory chuckle, it's a fantastic investment. These babies hold their value like you wouldn't believe, practically an appreciating asset. An appreciating asset that I couldn't help but note with a growing sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach we absolutely unequivocally could not afford, not without dipping significantly, perhaps even catastrophically into those very savings, those very investments that were supposedly held so securely, so inviolably in my name for our children's future. Following the jarring, almost surreal acquisition of the jet-black sports car, a vehicle whose aggressive predatory lines seemed to mock the very foundations of our previously so sensible, so carefully budgeted family life, a new, more persistent and infinitely more disquieting unease began to take root deep within my maternal and increasingly wifely intuition. Richard's explanations, or rather his glib, dismissive deflections regarding the car's exorbitant cost and its sudden, unheralded appearance in our driveway simply didn't add up. They felt hollow, disingenuous, almost contemptuous of my intelligence, of my right as his wife and financial partner to be consulted, to be informed on such a significant and clearly impactful family expenditure. This initial jarring financial anomaly, coupled with his increasingly secretive phone calls and his new, almost obsessive guarding of his personal laptop and financial papers, began to erode slowly but inexorably the comfortable, long-held bedrock of my previously unquestioning trust in him. I found myself for the first time in our nearly 20-year marriage starting to actively, if still somewhat hesitantly and with a considerable degree of internal guilt-ridden conflict, question him to probe however gently, however cautiously into the opaque and suddenly rather alarming world of our shared, or perhaps I was now beginning to fear, not so shared family finances. The catalyst for my first truly direct and ultimately deeply unsettling inquiry came not from another extravagant purchase, but from a seemingly mundane, almost trivial domestic necessity. Our eldest Olivia was in the process of applying for a prestigious summer art program, a program that required, as part of its extensive application process, detailed financial disclosures from both parents, including rather inconveniently certified copies of the deeds to any real estate properties we owned, ostensibly to assess eligibility for their limited needs-based scholarship fund. Richard Darling. I began one evening trying to keep my tone light casual, entirely unaccusatory, as he was yet again engrossed in some urgent confidential late-night work on his laptop in his home office, the door, as was now his invariable custom, firmly closed. I had knocked softly, then entered deliberately before he could wave me away with one of his usual impatient, "Not now, Elena, I'm incredibly busy" pronouncements. "I hate to bother you when you're working. I know how much pressure you're under, but Olivia's art program application is due next week, and they need copies of the deeds to the house and to those little rental properties Grandma Ramirez left me, the ones you've been so wonderfully managing all these years. Do you happen to know where the originals are kept? I seem to have misplaced my copies, and I can't for the life of me recall where we filed them after that last refinancing you organized." He didn't look up from his glowing screen immediately. There was a long, almost palpable pause, a silence that stretched taut and uncomfortable for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft, rhythmic click of his fingers on the keyboard. Then finally, with a sigh that seemed to convey a world of weary, put-upon impatience, he slowly, almost reluctantly, swiveled his expensive leather office chair around to face me, his expression carefully, almost unnaturally neutral. "The deeds, Elena," he repeated, his voice flat, devoid of its usual charming warmth. "Why on earth would Olivia's little art camp need copies of our property deeds? That seems rather excessive, doesn't it? A bit intrusive." "It's for the scholarship application," Richard, I explained patiently, trying to ignore the subtle dismissive condescension in his tone. The way he had so casually, so belittlingly referred to Olivia's highly competitive, nationally recognized art program as a little art camp. They have a financial aid component, and they require full disclosure. It's standard procedure, apparently." He frowned, a flicker of something, annoyance, anxiety, crossing his usually so well-composed features. "Well, I'm sure they're around here somewhere, Elena. In one of the filing cabinets, no doubt. You know how meticulous you usually are with these things." He gestured vaguely towards the bank of tall, gray metal filing cabinets that lined one wall of his office. Cabinets filled, I knew, with years upon years of our shared financial history. A history I was now, with a growing, sickening dread, beginning to suspect might hold some very dark, very unwelcome secrets. "I'm afraid I'm rather swamped with this Henderson Tower proposal right now, darling. Absolutely critical deadline. Can't possibly spare a moment to look for them myself. Perhaps you could have a good rummage around tomorrow. I'm sure they'll turn up. They always do." And with that, he swiveled his chair back towards his laptop, a clear, unequivocal signal that the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was well and truly over. The next day, and indeed for several frustrating, increasingly anxious days thereafter, I did indeed have a good rummage around. I meticulously, systematically searched every single drawer, every shelf, every dusty, long-forgotten box in Richard's home office, then in our shared bedroom filing cabinets, then, even in a fit of growing almost desperate paranoia, in the rarely visited cobweb-strewn recesses of our attic and basement. The original deed to our Maple Street home, the home my grandmother's legacy, had so significantly helped us to acquire the home that was by all legal and moral rights as much mine as it was his, was nowhere to be found. nor were the deeds to the 2 small rental properties I had inherited properties that Richard had for years. So helpfully, so efficiently managed on my behalf, their modest rental income supposedly being reinvested under his expert guidance into our children's ever-growing and apparently entirely illusory college fund. All I could find tucked away in the very back of a drawer marked Archived Property Investments. A drawer I rarely, if ever, had occasion to access was a slim, almost empty manila folder containing only a few rather blurry and clearly unofficial-looking photocopies of what appeared to be outdated property tax assessments and a single, ominously unfamiliar legal document. It was a quitclaim deed dated approximately 18 months prior, a date that coincided with a chilling, sickening precision with the very evening Richard had so casually, so charmingly asked me to sign those routine administrative papers for the supposed refinancing and tax-efficient restructuring of our investments. This quitclaim deed, I noted with a fresh wave of nauseating, world-tilting horror, bore what appeared to be my own legally notarized signature, a signature I had absolutely no recollection, no memory whatsoever of ever appending to such a document that effectively, and as far as I could decipher its dense, impenetrable legalese, seemed to relinquish all my legal right title and interest in those inherited rental properties, transferring them apparently to a newly formed and entirely unfamiliar to me corporate entity named Miller Family Holdings, Inc., a corporation whose sole listed director I discovered with a further devastating jolt of horrified comprehension after a quick, frantic online search was none other than Richard Miller, my husband. My blood ran cold. My hands began to tremble so violently that the damning document fluttered to the floor. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of grotesque, elaborate mistake, a misunderstanding. Richard, he couldn't do this to me, to us, to our children. When I confronted him later that evening, the quitclaim deed clutched in my shaking hand like a venomous snake, my voice a choked, incredulous whisper. His reaction was not one of shocked denial or even of feigned apologetic remorse. It was instead a display of cool, almost reptilian, and utterly infuriating, condescending dismissal. "Oh, that," he said, glancing briefly, almost boredly at the document I thrust before him, before returning his attention to the financial news channel flickering on the large-screen television in our den. "Honestly, Elena, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. That's just a minor legal formality, darling. A corporate restructuring, all perfectly above board, designed to protect our assets, your assets, from potential future liabilities. Creditors. Lawsuits. You know how litigious this world has become." "It's for your own good, Elena. For the children's good. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. Protect my assets." Richard, I repeated, my voice rising now, laced with a dangerous, unfamiliar tremor of dawning, incredulous fury. "By signing them over without my full knowledge or informed consent to a corporation that you solely control. How precisely does that protect me? And where, Richard, are the original deeds to this house, to our home, the home my grandmother's money paid for? Why can't I find them anywhere?" He sighed, then a long, theatrical put-upon sound, the sound of a man burdened by the irrational anxieties of a clearly overwrought and intellectually inferior wife. "Elena, darling, please," he said, his voice now dripping with that familiar, infuriatingly patronizing false sympathy. "You're getting yourself all worked up over absolutely nothing. The deeds they're perfectly safe. They're in a secure bank deposit box for safekeeping. It's a much more secure arrangement, especially with the way things are these days. You wouldn't want them to get lost or damaged or, God forbid, stolen, would you? Of course not. Now, can we please just drop this rather tedious and, frankly, rather insulting subject? I've had a very long, very stressful day at the firm, and I really don't have the energy for one of your little melodramas." His casual dismissal, his blatant gaslighting, his utter refusal to address my legitimate and now terrifyingly amplified concerns was like a physical blow. The fissures in the facade of our perfect marriage were no longer just subtle hairline cracks. They were rapidly, alarmingly widening into gaping, terrifying chasms, revealing glimpses of a dark, treacherous, and entirely unfamiliar landscape of deceit, of betrayal, of a profound, almost unimaginable financial and emotional perfidy that threatened to swallow me and my children whole. The whispers of doubt had now become a deafening, undeniable roar. Richard's condescending dismissal, his blatant, almost contemptuous refusal to address my legitimate and now terrifyingly amplified concerns about the missing property deeds and the mysterious Miller Family Holdings, Inc., did not, as he had perhaps arrogantly, foolishly anticipated, quell my anxieties. Instead, it served only to ignite a new, unfamiliar, and surprisingly potent fire within me. A fire fueled by a potent cocktail of fear, righteous anger, and a dawning, chilling certainty that I, and by extension, my children, were being systematically, deliberately, and comprehensively deceived, betrayed by the very man I had trusted with my life, with my future, with everything I held most dear. The days that followed that deeply unsettling and entirely unsatisfactory confrontation were filled with a new, almost unbearable tension in our once harmonious home. Richard became even more withdrawn, more secretive, his explanations for his increasingly frequent late nights at the office or his sudden unscheduled weekend business trips becoming even more vague, more implausible than before. He erected an almost impenetrable wall of evasiveness around himself, responding to my increasingly pointed though still carefully phrased questions about our finances, about the status of my properties, with a mixture of feigned boredom, feigned ignorance. Honestly, Elena, I leave all that tedious paperwork to the accountants. I barely glance at it myself, or when pressed too hard with flashes of a new, almost menacing defensive anger that was entirely out of character for the usually so charming, so unflappable man I thought I knew. "For God's sake, Elena," he'd snapped on one occasion when I had dared to question a particularly large, unexplained withdrawal from our joint savings account. "Are you accusing me of something? After all these years, after everything I've done for this family, perhaps you're the one with the trust issues here." His gaslighting, his attempts to turn the tables to make me feel like the irrational, suspicious, and ungrateful one, were I now recognized with a chilling, painful clarity. Classic, manipulative tactics. Tactics. He had perhaps, I now realized with a fresh wave of nauseating horror, been subtly, insidiously employing against me in various less overt forms for years. But I was no longer the naive, blindly trusting young woman he had married. The scales, however, painfully were falling from my eyes, and what I was beginning to see in the harsh, unforgiving light of my dawning, terrified comprehension was not a loving, supportive partner, but a cunning, duplicitous, and potentially utterly ruthless stranger. I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the knot of ice permanently lodged in my stomach that I would not simply let this go. The stakes were far too high. This wasn't just about a few missing documents or a temporary financial misunderstanding. This was about my grandmother's legacy. This was about the properties that were supposed to be my security, my children's inheritance. This was about the very foundation of our family's financial future, a future that Richard now seemed determined to control, to manipulate, and perhaps even to unilaterally and secretly dismantle for his own as yet unknown but undoubtedly selfish purposes. My quiet, desperate, and increasingly clandestine investigation into the true state of our family finances and into the shadowy, mysterious entity known as Miller Family Holdings, Inc., began in earnest, conducted mostly in the dead of night after Richard and the children were sound asleep, or during those precious solitary daytime hours when Olivia and Daniel were at school and Richard was supposedly at his office. I became a reluctant amateur sleuth, a heartbroken wife turned forensic investigator, navigating a bewildering, terrifying labyrinth of financial statements, legal documents, and online corporate databases. My only guides, my own increasingly alarmed maternal intuition, and a fierce, unshakable determination to uncover the truth, however devastating, however ugly it might prove to be. I started by meticulously, almost obsessively re-examining every single piece of financial paperwork I could find in our home, every bank statement, every investment summary, the ones Richard had deigned to share with me over the years, at least every tax return, every insurance policy. I created detailed spreadsheets, cross-referencing dates, amounts, account numbers, searching for patterns, for anomalies, for any transactions that seemed out of place, unexplained, or suspiciously timed in relation to that fateful refinancing 18 months prior. The task was daunting, overwhelming. I was not a financial expert. The language of these documents was often opaque, deliberately confusing, filled with jargon and fine print designed, it seemed, more to obfuscate than to clarify. But I persevered, fueled by a potent mixture of fear, anger, and a mother's indomitable protective will. I spent hours at the local library poring over books on basic accounting, on understanding corporate structures, on deciphering legal contracts. My old, almost forgotten academic research skills slowly, painfully reawakening. I even, in moments of particularly acute desperation, resorted to discreet, anonymous online forums, posing hypothetical questions to try and understand the implications of certain legal clauses or financial maneuvers I had stumbled upon in Richard's increasingly suspicious paperwork. Slowly, painstakingly, a disturbing, almost unbelievable picture began to emerge. It became agonizingly clear that Richard had not just restructured my inherited rental properties into Miller Family Holdings, Inc. for tax efficiency or asset protection, as he had so glibly, so reassuringly claimed. He had, it appeared, used those properties, my properties, as collateral for a series of increasingly large, increasingly risky, and entirely undisclosed personal business loans that were now, I began to suspect, with a dawning, sickening horror, in serious, perhaps even catastrophic default. And then I found it. The smoking gun, or rather, a series of them. Tucked away in the very back of a rarely used filing cabinet in his home office beneath a pile of outdated architectural journals, I discovered a hidden folder. A folder simply, almost innocuously labeled Personal Ventures. Inside was not just one, but several recently issued and very official-looking default notices from various financial institutions, all addressed to Richard Miller, all pertaining to substantial overdue loans that were, I noted, with a fresh wave of nauseating, world-tilting shock, directly secured against the very rental properties my grandmother had left to me, the properties I had so foolishly, so trustingly allowed him to manage. And stapled to one of those default notices, a notice threatening imminent foreclosure, was a hastily scribbled, almost desperate-looking internal memo from Richard's own architectural firm. A memo from his senior partners expressing grave concerns about his recent erratic financial behavior, his unexplained absences from the office, and the potential negative impact of his increasingly precarious personal financial situation on the firm's reputation and client relationships. They were, it seemed, considering severing all professional ties with him if the situation was not rectified immediately. The pieces of the horrifying puzzle began to fall with a sickening, inexorable thud into place. Richard wasn't just a bad investor. He was, it seemed, a desperate, drowning man, a man whose own reckless financial decisions, whose own secret high-stakes gambles had brought him to the very brink of professional and personal ruin. And our home, the home my grandmother's legacy had secured, and my inherited rental properties, the assets that were supposed to be my security, my children's future, were not, as he had so lovingly, so reassuringly claimed, being protected by his astute financial maneuvering. They were, in fact, being systematically, deliberately, and with a breathtaking, almost sociopathic callousness, sacrificed, plundered, used as a desperate last-ditch lifeline to try and salvage his own self-inflicted financial shipwreck. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, a gnawing unease. It was a stark, undeniable, and utterly comprehensively devastating reality. The discovery of that hidden folder that Pandora's box crammed with the undeniable, tangible evidence of Richard's financial desperation and his impending professional doom, while utterly comprehensively devastating to the last vestiges of my naive marital illusions, also served paradoxically and with a surprising, almost immediate potency to solidify my wavering resolve to galvanize me into a new, more focused, and infinitely more determined, almost ruthlessly pragmatic phase of action. The time for quiet, solitary, tear-filled investigation, for hopeful, almost childlike and entirely futile attempts at direct wifely confrontation and appeals to his long-since vanished conscience, was clearly, irrevocably, and blessedly over. Richard Miller was not just a foolish, misguided man who had made a few unfortunate, if significant, bad investments. He was, it now seemed terrifyingly, undeniably clear to my newly brutally unclouded eyes. A desperate, cornered, and entirely self-absorbed man, capable, it appeared from the evidence before me, of almost any deception, any betrayal, any sacrifice of others to save his own skin, to preserve his own carefully constructed and now rapidly, spectacularly crumbling facade of effortless success and unshakable masculine competence. And I, Elena Ramirez, his wife of nearly 2 decades, the mother of his 2 precious children, the woman whose unwavering trust, whose substantial inheritance, whose very future he had so casually, so cruelly, so comprehensively exploited, was, it seemed, with a chilling, almost sociopathic clarity in his panicked calculations, entirely and conveniently expendable. I knew then with a certainty that was as cold and hard and unyielding as the knot of ice that seemed to have taken up permanent painful residence in the pit of my stomach, that I could no longer, not for another single agonizing day, afford to fight this insidious, multi-layered battle alone. I needed professional help. I needed dispassionate, expert legal counsel. I needed someone who could not only navigate the treacherous labyrinthine and, for me, entirely mystifying complexities of corporate law, of property fraud, of marital asset deception, but someone who could also stand with me, advocate fiercely for me, and fight relentlessly for me against Richard, against his undoubtedly influential, and I was beginning to suspect with a new, chilling, and deeply unsettling unease, potentially deeply complicit family, and against whatever formidable, expensive, and morally flexible legal arsenal they would undoubtedly, and with a characteristic lack of compunction, unleash once they fully realized that I was no longer their passive, unsuspecting, easily manipulated, and conveniently ignorant victim. My first and most crucial strategic phone call, made that very same life-altering afternoon from the relative anonymity of a payphone in a bustling downtown coffee shop, I no longer trusted the security of my own home phone line or even my personal cell phone. Such was the depth of my newfound and entirely warranted paranoia, was to a woman whose name and formidable reputation had been discreetly, almost reverently whispered to me some years prior by a close trusted and recently and very successfully divorced friend. My friend had herself navigated a particularly acrimonious, high-stakes, and financially complex divorce from a wealthy, powerful, and notoriously unscrupulous ex-husband, emerging not just intact, but thanks to this lawyer financially secure and emotionally empowered. Ms. Anya Sharma. She was, my friend had assured me with a knowing, almost conspiratorial, and deeply admiring wink, not just another competent family law attorney. She was in the often brutal, unforgiving arena of high-stakes divorce and financial fraud litigation, a veritable legal warrior, a dragon slayer, a woman renowned throughout our city's legal and financial circles, and indeed far beyond for her razor-sharp, almost preternatural intellect, her encyclopedic, almost photographic knowledge of financial and family law, her unshakable, almost terrifying, and legendarily effective courtroom presence, and her unwavering, almost ferocious, and deeply personally invested dedication to her clients. Particularly, my friend had emphasized to women who, like me, found themselves victimized, exploited, or otherwise unjustly, cruelly treated by powerful, manipulative, and often narcissistic men. She was, my friend, had also somewhat ominously warned incredibly, almost prohibitively expensive. She was notoriously, almost legendarily selective in the often high-profile cases she chose to take on, and she possessed a client waiting list that was rumored in hushed, awestruck legal circles to be months, if not in some instances years long. But my friend had concluded with a conviction that brooked absolutely no argument. If anyone on this earth can help you unravel this horrifying mess, Elena, if anyone can bring a man like Richard Miller and his undoubtedly equally complicit family to their knees, if anyone can get you back what is rightfully, legally, and morally yours, it's Anya Sharma. She's your only, your best, your last hope. Beg, borrow, or steal Elena, but get that woman on your side. Securing even an initial 30-minute consultation with the almost mythical Ms. Anya Sharma was in itself a Herculean, almost comically frustrating and deeply humbling endeavor. It involved a barrage of increasingly desperate yet always meticulously polite phone calls to her glacially polite, impeccably professional, and formidably efficient gatekeeper of a senior paralegal, a woman whose own reputation for fierce loyalty and almost psychic anticipation of Ms. Sharma's needs was in itself legendary. It required the submission of a lengthy, detailed, and emotionally draining preliminary case summary outlining the broad and deeply distressing strokes of my situation. And then it necessitated an agonizing, nerve-wracking 2-week wait for a response, a period during which I oscillated wildly between fragile, desperate hope and a crushing, almost certain despair. But finally, blessedly, miraculously, an appointment, a single, precious 30-minute slot in her incredibly overbooked calendar was granted. I walked into Missy Anya Sharma's opulent, art-filled top-floor law office, a minimalist masterpiece of glass steel, and an almost intimidatingly serene panoramic view of the city skyline, feeling a strange, almost disorienting and deeply paradoxical mixture of profound, almost childlike trepidation and a dawning, fragile, yet undeniably potent adult hope. She was in person, even more formidable, even more immediately, impressively commanding than her already considerable reputation had suggested. A woman in her late 50s, perhaps, though her age was almost impossible to determine with any certainty. She possessed piercing, intelligent, and unnervingly perceptive dark eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing to see right through any pretense, any artifice, any attempt at dissimulation. Her silver-streaked, impeccably cut black hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She wore an exquisitely tailored, dark charcoal gray power suit that radiated quiet, understated, yet utterly unmistakable authority. And she exuded an aura of calm, focused, almost preternatural self-assurance that was simultaneously deeply, profoundly intimidating and strangely, unexpectedly, almost inexplicably comforting. I laid out my story, my voice, despite my most desperate efforts to maintain a semblance of composure, trembling slightly, occasionally cracking with a resurgence of raw, unadulterated emotion as I recounted the years of my misplaced, almost childlike trust in Richard, the routine administrative papers he had so casually, so charmingly duped me into signing, the subsequent deeply unsettling discovery of the missing property deeds, the mysterious, faceless entity known as Miller Family Holdings, Inc. Thus, the damning, irrefutable default notices from a slew of angry, impatient creditors. And finally, the devastating, soul-crushing realization of Richard's profound, multifaceted, and almost unimaginable betrayal. Not just of me, his wife, but of our innocent, unsuspecting children. I presented her with hands that still, despite my best efforts, shook almost uncontrollably with my meticulously organized, if admittedly still somewhat amateurishly compiled, burgeoning folder of evidence. The photocopied, and I was now almost certain fraudulently obtained quitclaim deed. The annotated highlighted bank statements tracing the illicit flow of funds. The damning internal memo from Richard's own architectural firm hinting at his professional and financial implosion. Everything I had thus far in my desperate, solitary quest for truth managed to unearth. Ms. Anya Sharma listened intently, patiently, without a single interruption, without a flicker of discernible emotion on her strong, intelligent, and remarkably unlined face. her keen, perceptive dark eyes fixed unwavering, unblinkingly on mine as I spoke her silence, more probing, more insightful than 1,000 spoken questions could ever have been. When I had finally exhaustedly, tearfully finished my rambling, often incoherent, but utterly, painfully heartfelt account, a long, contemplative silence filled the opulent, sun-drenched conference room. A silence broken only by the distant, muted hum of city traffic far, far below. Then she spoke. Her voice, when it finally came, was low, calm, almost surprisingly gentle, yet imbued with an undeniable, almost palpable undercurrent of steely, righteous indignation and a quiet, reassuring, and infinitely welcome confidence. "Elena," she said, addressing me by my first name in a way that felt immediately, unexpectedly supportive, almost sisterly. "What you have described, what you have endured, what your husband Richard Miller and potentially his entire family have perpetrated against you is not just a case of marital infidelity or even simple financial mismanagement, however egregious. This is on its face and based on the compelling preliminary evidence you have so courageously, so diligently gathered a clear, systematic, and deeply disturbing pattern of calculated financial fraud, of egregious breach of fiduciary trust, of blatant, unconscionable forgery, and of profound, ongoing emotional and psychological abuse. This is not just a divorce case, Elena. This is a declaration of war. A war they started. A war they clearly, arrogantly believed you were too weak, too naive, too domesticated to ever fight back against. They were, I assure you, profoundly, catastrophically mistaken." She paused, allowing her words their full, empowering, and deeply validating import to sink in. A small, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably fierce smile touched the corners of her lips. "And you, Elena Ramirez," she continued, her dark eyes now gleaming with a new, almost predatory intensity, an intensity that sent a shiver not of fear this time, but of a dawning, exhilarating, almost savage hope coursing through my veins. "You, my dear, have just officially retained the services of Anya Sharma. And Anya Sharma," she concluded, her voice now a low, dangerous, and deeply, profoundly satisfying purr. "Anya Sharma, Elena never loses a war she chooses to fight. In that single transformative moment, in that sun-drenched, art-filled top-floor law office, I felt something shift within me, something profound, something irrevocable. The fear, while still a lingering, shadowy presence, was no longer paralyzing. The despair, though still an aching tender wound, no longer felt all-consuming. They had been overshadowed, almost entirely eclipsed by a new, unfamiliar, and incredibly, wonderfully empowering sense of hope, and by the dawning, exhilarating realization that I, Elena Ramirez, was no longer alone in this fight. I had a warrior, a dragon slayer, a veritable force of legal nature now firmly, unequivocally, and fiercely in my corner. The labyrinth of lies, however dark, however convoluted, however terrifying, suddenly seemed navigable. The truth, however deeply buried, however painfully elusive, now felt attainable. The real battle, the one for justice, for restitution, for my children's future, for my own reclaimed dignity, was about to begin. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I, Elena Ramirez, actually believed with every fiber of my being that I might actually win. The subsequent weeks under Ms. Sharma's brilliant, relentless, and often quite intimidating tutelage were a crash course in the brutal, unforgiving realities of high-stakes legal warfare and a profound, often painful, but ultimately deeply empowering education in my own hitherto unsuspected capacity for resilience, for strategic thinking, for unwavering, almost obsessive attention to detail. Ms. Sharma and her crack team of forensic accountants, private investigators. Yes, she had her own, even more discreet, even more effective Ms. Albright, it seemed, and fiercely intelligent. Young legal associates descended upon Richard Miller's tangled, duplicitous financial life with the focused, merciless intensity of a pack of highly trained and very hungry wolves. They subpoenaed years of his personal and business bank records, his investment statements, his credit card bills, his phone logs, his travel itineraries. They meticulously traced the convoluted, often deliberately obscured flow of funds from our children's plundered college account, from my grandmother's violated inheritance, from our other systematically drained joint savings, into his myriad hidden personal offshore accounts, towards the bottomless, voracious maw of his disastrous and, as it turned out, largely fictitious personal ventures, and with a sickening, almost voyeuristic precision, directly repeatedly into the eager waiting and undoubtedly very well manicured hands of his long-term mistress, a woman whose identity and whose own rather checkered financial and romantic history Ms. Sharma's investigators unearthed with an almost chilling and deeply satisfying efficiency. The full, unvarnished, and utterly devastating picture that emerged from their meticulous, painstaking investigation was even uglier, even more damning, even more comprehensively sociopathic than I, in my darkest, most cynical moments, could ever have possibly imagined. Richard Miller hadn't just been a foolish, reckless gambler who had made a few disastrous, impulsive financial mistakes. He had, it was now undeniably, irrefutably clear, been engaged in a long-term, systematic, and highly sophisticated campaign of deliberate, calculated financial fraud, not just against me, his wife, but also, it appeared, against several of his own, now former business partners, and even, it was rumored, against certain less than scrupulous offshore investors whose methods of debt collection were notoriously and terrifyingly effective. Our family home on Maple Street, the one my grandmother's legacy had so significantly helped us to acquire, the one I had poured so much of my heart and soul into creating, was not, it turned out, in any immediate legal danger of foreclosure from his creditors, as I had initially hysterically feared. No, Richard's plan, Ms. Sharma explained with a grim, almost chilling admiration for its sheer cold-blooded audacity, had been far more insidious, far more permanent. The routine administrative papers he had so charmingly, so lovingly duped me into signing 18 months prior, the ones that had supposedly streamlined our assets for tax efficiency, had in fact been a complex series of legal documents that had effectively and entirely, without my informed consent, transferred the sole, unencumbered ownership of not just my inherited rental properties, but also, and most devastatingly, our beloved Maple Street family home into the shadowy, impenetrable, and entirely Richard-controlled corporate entity known as Miller Family Holdings, Inc. He hadn't just mortgaged our home to the hilt to cover his debts. He had, in essence, stolen it from me, from our children outright, leaving us legally with absolutely nothing but the clothes on our backs and the rapidly dwindling balance in our joint checking account, an account from which he was Ms. Sharma's team quickly discovered still actively, almost daily, siphoning funds. The sheer, cold-blooded, premeditated evil of his actions, the profound, almost unimaginable depth of his betrayal, not just of our marriage vows, but of his sacred paternal duty to protect, to provide for his own innocent children, left me, even now, even after all I had already endured, utterly, comprehensively speechless, with a fresh, searing wave of horrified, incredulous disbelief. This wasn't just a cheating husband, a reckless gambler, a failed businessman. This was a monster I had loved, a monster I had trusted, a monster I had shared my life, my bed, my children with for nearly 2 decades. The battle ahead, Ms. Sharma cautioned me, her voice gentle but firm, would be long, arduous, and undoubtedly incredibly emotionally taxing. Richard and his equally culpable, and I now suspected entirely complicit family, for how could they not have known on some level about his financial machinations? His increasingly desperate, erratic behavior would fight us, she predicted, with every dirty, underhanded, and legally ambiguous trick in their well-funded, morally bankrupt playbook. They would try to discredit me, to defame me, to paint me as a bitter, vengeful, gold-digging ex-wife. They would try to drag out the legal proceedings indefinitely, hoping to exhaust my limited financial resources to break my already so fragile emotional spirit. But they will not succeed, Elena. Ms. Sharma had concluded, her dark eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering conviction that sent a surge of renewed, almost defiant strength coursing through my weary, battered soul. Because we have something they do not. We have the truth. We have the evidence. And we have, my dear, a righteous, unshakable, and ultimately entirely unbeatable cause. Now let's go get back what is rightfully, legally, and morally yours. And let's make Richard Miller and anyone else who aided and abetted his despicable crimes pay and pay dearly for every single tear you have shed, for every sleepless night you have endured, for every dream they so callously, so cruelly tried to steal from you and from your children. And so armed with an irrefutable, meticulously documented case, a brilliant, fearless legal warrior by my side, and the fierce, unyielding, and entirely righteous fury of a mother scorned and a woman profoundly, unforgivably betrayed, I, Elena Ramirez, stepped out of the shadows of my grief, my fear, my self-doubt, and into the harsh unforgiving, but ultimately I prayed just arena of legal warfare. The web of deceit, so carefully, so cunningly woven by Richard Miller and his accomplices, was about to be systematically, comprehensively, and very, very publicly unraveled. The legal strategy devised by Ms. Anya Sharma was in its elegant simplicity and its ruthless, multi-pronged effectiveness a thing of almost terrifying beauty. We would not, she decreed, immediately rush into a messy public and potentially protracted divorce, filing a move that would undoubtedly alert Richard and his family, giving them precious and potentially disastrous time to further conceal assets, to destroy evidence, or to concoct even more elaborate perjurious counter-narratives. No. Our first and most crucial offensive maneuver would be a swift, unexpected, and legally unassailable preemptive strike, a meticulously prepared ex parte emergency application to the family court for an immediate temporary but comprehensive asset freeze on all known and suspected bank accounts, properties, and investments held by Richard Miller, by Miller Family Holdings, Inc., and with a stroke of strategic genius that made me almost gasp with admiration by his parents, Patricia and David Miller Sr., and even by his two somewhat feckless but undoubtedly financially entangled siblings, Stephen and Caroline. Ms. Sharma's preliminary investigations, conducted with a chilling, almost psychic efficiency by her team of forensic accountants and private investigators, had strongly indicated, if not yet definitively proven, a deeply disturbing pattern of familial complicity, of assets being suspiciously and perhaps fraudulently shuffled between various Miller family members and their numerous, often opaque corporate entities in a clear, almost desperate attempt to shield them from Richard's increasingly aggressive creditors and undoubtedly from any potential claims arising from our impending and now clearly unavoidable divorce. We need to stop the bleeding, Elena, immediately and decisively. Ms. Sharma had explained, her voice calm but imbued with an undeniable urgency. Before Richard or his equally culpable family can further dissipate or abscond with what rightfully, legally, and morally belongs to you and your children. This emergency asset freeze, if granted by the court, based on the compelling evidence of fraud and imminent financial risk we will present, will effectively paralyze their ability to move, hide, or further squander any significant assets pending a full court-ordered forensic audit of their entire and, I suspect, deeply entangled financial empire. The preparation of that emergency court application was an all-consuming, almost round-the-clock whirlwind of activity over the next 72 harrowing, sleep-deprived hours. Ms. Sharma and her team worked with a focused, almost ferocious intensity, meticulously assembling our voluminous evidence, drafting complex legal affidavits, citing obscure but relevant case law, preparing for every conceivable legal counter-argument Richard's inevitable high-priced legal team might throw at them. My own role was to provide an endless stream of information, to sign countless documents, to relive in excruciating, tearful detail the entire sordid history of Richard's financial and emotional betrayals for the official court record. It was a deeply draining, emotionally eviscerating process, but with each signed affidavit, with each piece of damning evidence meticulously cataloged and submitted, I felt a tiny, almost imperceptible, but nonetheless significant flicker of my own long-dormant power, my own agency beginning to reassert itself. I was no longer just a passive weeping victim. I was an active, albeit still terrified participant in my own and my children's fight for justice. The ex parte hearing, a hearing conducted without the immediate presence or prior notification of the opposing party, a legal maneuver reserved for situations of demonstrable imminent and irreparable harm, was scheduled with a surprising, almost blessed alacrity by a sympathetic duty judge for late Friday afternoon, just before the courts closed for the weekend. Ms. Sharma presented our case with her usual breathtaking combination of razor-sharp legal intellect, meticulous factual command, and a quiet, understated but utterly compelling moral authority. She laid bare Richard's systematic plunder of our marital assets, his fraudulent transfer of my inherited properties, his callous dissipation of our children's college fund, all supported by the irrefutable damning evidence we had so painstakingly, so secretly amassed. She highlighted the very real, very imminent danger of further asset flight given Richard's increasingly desperate financial situation and his now clearly established pattern of deceit and concealment. The judge, a seasoned, no-nonsense veteran of countless acrimonious family law battles, listened intently, her expression growing increasingly visibly grim as Ms. Sharma methodically, devastatingly dismantled Richard Miller's carefully constructed facade of respectable affluence, revealing the rotten, deceitful core beneath. After less than an hour of Ms. Sharma's eloquent evidence-backed presentation, Judge Harrison, without even requesting a recess to consider her decision, brought down her gavel with a sharp, decisive crack that seemed to echo with the undeniable, satisfying thud of justice. Application for an emergency ex parte asset freeze as outlined in petitioner's motion is hereby and unequivocally granted effective immediately. Judge Harrison declared, her voice firm, her gaze stern, her words a balm to my raw, bleeding soul. All financial institutions, brokerage firms, and property registrars listed herein are hereby ordered to immediately freeze all accounts and transactions associated with the respondents. Richard Miller Family Holdings, Inc., Patricia Miller, David Miller Sr., Stephen Miller, and Caroline Miller, pending further order of this court. A full forensic audit of all marital and contested assets to be conducted by a court-appointed independent examiner is also hereby ordered, and a formal hearing with all parties present is scheduled for 9 a.m. next Wednesday morning to address the continuation of this order and to set a schedule for further proceedings in the matter of Miller versus Miller. This court, Ms. Sharma, Ms. Ramirez, she added, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly as it met mine, takes allegations of financial fraud and the endangerment of minor children's financial security with the utmost, and I do mean utmost, seriousness. The relief that washed over me in that moment was so profound, so overwhelming, it was almost a physical sensation. A tangible lifting of an immense, suffocating weight from my shoulders, leaving me lightheaded, almost dizzy, with a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and a dawning, exhilarating sense of empowerment. We had won the first crucial battle. Richard and his entire complicit family were, at least for now, financially paralyzed, their ability to further harm us, to further plunder what was rightfully ours, decisively, legally curtailed. The news of the court-ordered asset freeze, delivered simultaneously to Richard and his various family members late that Friday afternoon by a team of grim-faced, official-looking process servers, undoubtedly landed like a series of precisely targeted tactical nuclear explosions in the heart of their previously so secure, so complacent, so insulated world. I could only imagine with a certain grim, if not entirely charitable satisfaction, the scenes of panic, of disbelief, of impotent spluttering rage that must have erupted in their various opulent and now suddenly financially constrained households. The family meeting, the one I had with Ms. Sharma's strategic council preemptively and somewhat audaciously demanded be convened at my own, now legally secured Maple Street home for that very Sunday afternoon. ostensibly to discuss with a feigned, almost comical air of wifely concern the sudden, inexplicable, and deeply worrying freezing of our family's financial assets, was as anticipated a masterpiece of barely suppressed hysteria, of thinly veiled accusations, and of a dawning collective familial terror. They all arrived. Richard, his parents Patricia and David Sr., his siblings Stephen and Caroline, their faces a mixture of ashen disbelief, sputtering indignation, and a new, unfamiliar, and for them deeply unsettling emotion, fear. They clearly had no idea, not yet, of the true, devastating extent of the evidence I had amassed of the legal juggernaut Ms. Sharma had so skillfully, so swiftly unleashed upon them. They still, in their monumental arrogance, seemed to believe this was some kind of temporary bureaucratic misunderstanding, a colossal banking error. Perhaps even some of them hinted with dark, paranoid suspicion, a malicious, underhanded tactic employed by one of Richard's many disgruntled and now presumably vengeful former business associates. I, Elena Ramirez, the quiet, unassuming, and so long underestimated wife and daughter-in-law, played my role to perfection. I feigned equal bewilderment, equal distress at this inexplicable financial catastrophe. I wrung my hands. I offered them weak, lukewarm tea. I listened with an air of profound, shared concern as they raged, as they speculated, as they desperately, frantically tried to piece together how their carefully constructed world of effortless affluence could have so suddenly, so completely imploded. And then, when their initial chaotic storm of panicked disbelief and indignant outrage had finally exhaustedly begun to subside, when a new, more fearful, more receptive silence had settled upon the room, I, with a calm, quiet, almost sorrowful dignity that I hadn't known I possessed, and with Ms. Anya Sharma, my formidable legal gladiator, now, unexpectedly, and for them terrifyingly revealed, stepping silently, purposefully into the room from where she had been, discreetly, patiently waiting in my adjoining study. I began to speak. Actually, Richard, I began, my voice surprisingly steady, surprisingly strong. My gaze fixed directly, unwavering, on my husband's now utterly comprehensively horrified face. I believe I can shed some considerable light on this rather unfortunate financial situation. You see, this isn't a banking error. This isn't a misunderstanding. And it certainly isn't the work of some disgruntled business associate. This Richard, this asset freeze, this reckoning is entirely and solely of my doing, my and Ms. Sharma's, of course. I then, with Ms. Sharma occasionally, and with devastating legal precision, interjecting to clarify a complex financial point, or to underscore a particularly egregious legal transgression, proceeded to calmly, methodically, and with an almost clinical detachment that belied the years of pain of betrayal, of suppressed rage, simmering just beneath my carefully composed surface, lay bare the entirety of their collective multi-layered and deeply despicably fraudulent financial and emotional betrayal of me and of my children. I presented them not with photocopies this time, but with the original damning documents, the quitclaim deed bearing my forged, or at the very least fraudulently obtained signature, the labyrinthine corporate registration papers for Miller Family Holdings, Inc., clearly listing Richard as the sole director and beneficiary, and with a chilling, almost comical transparency, his mother Patricia and his brother Stephen as silent, non-beneficial partners. The irrefutable bank statements tracing the systematic multi-year plunder of my grandmother's inheritance of our children's college fund of our joint marital savings, all siphoned into Richard's hidden offshore accounts or used to prop up his failing illusory personal ventures, or most gallingly lavished upon his long-term mistress, the now infamous, at least within the Miller family, Clarissa Dubois. I even, with a certain grim theatrical flourish, played for them on a small, discreet digital recorder I placed in the center of the antique coffee table a few carefully selected and particularly self-incriminating excerpts from Richard's own arrogant, dismissive, and entirely damnably untruthful pronouncements from our previous private conversations, his voice so familiar, so beloved now echoing in that silent, stunned room, like the pronouncements of a condemned and entirely unrepentant liar. The effect on the assembled Miller clan was profound, devastating, absolute. Richard himself, faced with the irrefutable multi-layered evidence of his own comprehensive, almost sociopathic perfidy, seemed to physically shrink to deflate before my very eyes. His handsome face a mask of pale, sweaty, ashen terror. His usually so articulate, so persuasive voice reduced to a series of choked, incoherent, almost animalistic whimpers. His mother, Patricia, the formidable iron-willed matriarch, for once in her life looked utterly, comprehensively speechless, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the sudden shocking pallor of her skin. Her eyes, those cold, appraising blue eyes now wide with a mixture of horrified disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding of the true, monstrous nature of her favored son. David Sr., her husband, looked simply old, defeated, broken. His siblings, Stephen and Caroline, exchanged panicked, almost furtive glances, their usual superficial self-assurance entirely comically stripped away, replaced by a raw, almost childlike fear. The gilded facade of the perfect Miller family, so carefully constructed, so meticulously maintained for so many, many years, had not just cracked. It had, in the space of a single devastating hour, in the harsh, unforgiving light of irrefutable truth, utterly, comprehensively, and very, very publicly imploded. The chickens, as they say, had finally and with a vengeance come home to roost. And I, Elena Ramirez, the quiet, unassuming, and so long, so cruelly underestimated wife and daughter-in-law, was, it seemed, the entirely unexpected and surprisingly formidable architect of their long overdue and richly, richly deserved day of reckoning. The immediate aftermath of that cataclysmic family meeting at my Maple Street home was, as one might expect, a period of intense, chaotic, and often deeply, almost unbearably unpleasant legal and emotional fallout. The Millers, faced with the undeniable, irrefutable evidence of Richard's and, by extension, their own, at varying degrees of complicity and self-serving blindness, profound multi-year financial and emotional betrayal, and with the very real, very public and professionally, socially, and financially ruinous threat of Miss Anya Sharma's impending no-holds-barred legal onslaught had little, if any, room left to maneuver, to deny, to obfuscate, to intimidate. They were, in every sense of the word, caught, exposed, defeated. Their high-powered and undoubtedly very expensive legal team, after a single brief and, I suspect, deeply disheartening meeting with Ms. Sharma, in which she undoubtedly and with her characteristic chilling precision laid out the full, unassailable strength of our case, clearly and wisely advised them against any further attempts at resistance at litigation. The risks, both financial and reputational, were simply overwhelmingly too great. And so, with a speed that even now somewhat astounds me, a comprehensive, legally binding, and for me, deeply, profoundly satisfying settlement agreement was drafted. Negotiated, though again, there was in reality very little for them to negotiate from a position of strength, and ultimately signed by all parties. Richard Miller, my now thoroughly disgraced and soon-to-be officially ex-husband, agreed without any further futile protest to all of my and Ms. Sharma's original non-negotiable terms. The fraudulent quitclaim deed that had so treacherously, so deceitfully transferred ownership of my inherited rental properties, and more devastatingly, our beloved Maple Street family home into the shadowy Richard-controlled Miller Family Holdings, Inc., was declared null and void, a product of demonstrable fraud and undue influence. The full, unencumbered legal title to all of those properties was immediately and irrevocably restored to my name solely. The children's plundered college fund, or at least a very significant court-ordered portion of it, was to be immediately and fully replenished by Richard and by his parents, who it turned out had been the silent, non-beneficial partners in several of his more dubious personal ventures, and were thus deemed by Miss Sharma, and ultimately by the court, to share a degree of financial culpability from whatever remaining legitimate and now significantly diminished assets they still collectively possessed. A strict, legally enforceable, and non-modifiable repayment schedule was established for any outstanding balance, secured with a certain grim poetic justice, against Richard's own, now rather meager future, earnings, his depleted pension fund, and even with a final satisfying flourish from Ms. Sharma against any potential future inheritance he might receive from his own family's now considerably less impressive estate. I was awarded without contest full, unassailable legal and primary physical custody of Olivia and Daniel. Richard was granted only severely restricted, professionally supervised, and entirely at my, and more importantly, at the children's discretion visitation rights. Rights that were furthermore made explicitly and non-negotiably conditional upon him immediately enrolling in and diligently verifiably completing a comprehensive court-approved intensive program of psychological counseling for his clearly demonstrated pathological lying. His narcissistic personality disorder, a diagnosis Ms. Sharma's retained psychological expert had, after a court-ordered evaluation, delivered with a chilling professional certainty, and his undeniable destructive addictive behaviors, whether they be financial recklessness, emotional manipulation, or serial infidelity. A substantial, non-negotiable, and inflation-adjusted spousal and child support agreement designed to ensure not just our basic ongoing needs, but also a comfortable, secure, and entirely appropriate standard of living for myself and our 2 children. A standard commensurate with what we had become accustomed to during our 20-year marriage, a marriage whose financial success I now with a new empowered clarity fully unapologetically recognized had been built as much, if not more, on my own unseen, unacknowledged, and entirely unpaid domestic, emotional, and even financial contributions and sacrifices, as on his more visible, more lauded professional achievements, was also put firmly, legally, and irrevocably in place, secured once again against any and all of his remaining and potential future assets and income streams. The divorce itself, the final legal severing of our toxic 20-year marital bond, was finalized with a quiet, almost anticlimactic, and for me, profoundly liberating efficiency a few short months later. It was a brief, impersonal, almost sterile hearing before a no-nonsense, seen-it-all family court judge who, having been privately and very thoroughly apprised by Ms. Sharma of the egregious underlying and almost unbelievable details of Richard Miller's extensive, multifaceted conduct, wasted little, if any, precious judicial time in granting my petition and in formally, unequivocally ratifying our comprehensive and, for him, utterly devastating settlement agreement. There were no further arguments from his side, no last-minute desperate legal dramas, no pathetic self-serving pleas for leniency. He simply sat there beside his grim-faced and, I suspect, profoundly relieved to be done with it all lawyer, a pale, diminished, almost ghostly figure. A man stripped bare, not just financially, but emotionally, psychologically of his former arrogance, his confident manipulative charm, his carefully constructed lifelong facade of effortless success and unquestioned respectability. He looked, I thought, with a sudden, unexpected, and almost unwelcome pang of something that might terrifyingly have been a distant vestigial and entirely inappropriate pity, utterly comprehensively and irrevocably defeated. His reign of deceit, of betrayal, of casual, unthinking cruelty was at long, long last well and truly over. As I walked out of that sterile, impersonal courtroom that crisp, clear autumn afternoon, a newly and officially irrevocably divorced woman, a single mother now solely and with a newfound, almost exhilarating sense of empowerment, responsible for the future well-being and happiness of my 2 precious, resilient children. I didn't feel the elation, the triumphant fist-pumping, almost vindictive joy I had perhaps on some darker, more primitive level, occasionally almost guiltily anticipated during the long, arduous, and often so very painful preceding months of battle. Instead, what I felt with a profound, almost overwhelming intensity was a deep, bone-deep, and almost cellular weariness, an almost unbearable sense of relief, yes, absolutely, but also, undeniably, a lingering, pervasive, and deeply poignant sadness. A sadness for the 20 long years wasted in a marriage built on a foundation of lies, of illusions, of my own almost willful blindness. A sadness for the trust, once so absolute, so sacred, so unshakable, that had been so callously, so systematically, so cruelly shattered beyond any possibility of repair. A sadness, too, a profound aching sadness for my children Olivia and Daniel, who despite my most valiant, most ferocious efforts to shield them from the ugliest, most corrosive aspects of their parents' acrimonious conflict, had inevitably, unavoidably been deeply lastingly wounded by the shrapnel of their father's profound, almost unthinkable betrayal, by the violent premature dissolution of the only family, the only home they had ever known. But beneath the undeniable weariness, beneath the lingering, bittersweet sadness, there was also something else. Something new, something unexpected, something precious, something that had been almost entirely suffocatingly absent from my life for so very, very long. A quiet, burgeoning, and incredibly, wonderfully, almost miraculously empowering sense of peace. And with that peace, a dawning, unshakable, and deeply personally resonant understanding. The greatest, most meaningful, most transformative battle a woman will ever truly fight is not in the end against an external adversary, however formidable, however malicious, however deserving of defeat they may be. It is rather the far more challenging, far more crucial, and ultimately far more rewarding internal battle to reclaim her own voice, her own strength, her own unshakable intrinsic and entirely non-negotiable worth, in the often devastating face of betrayal, of injustice, of profound soul-crushing despair. And that battle I, Elena Ramirez, knew with every fiber of my being, with every beat of my now steady, now strong, now wonderfully, exhilaratingly free heart. I had not just fought with courage, with tenacity, with an integrity that had remained against all odds blessedly intact. I had finally, blessedly, and unequivocally won. The ghost of our bitter, deceitful marriage, though perhaps like all deeply wounding ghosts, never to be entirely, completely exorcised from the deepest recesses of my memory, had at long, long last been stripped of its insidious power to haunt, to harm, to control, to diminish. My future, and the infinitely more important, infinitely more precious future of my beloved children, Olivia and Daniel, was now finally, blessedly, and entirely, wonderfully, thrillingly our own. To shape, to create, to live, with truth, with integrity, with joy, and with an abundance of genuine, hard-won, and truly, truly priceless love. The perfect marriage had indeed, and with a devastating finality, shattered. But from its smoldering, painful ruins, something new, something authentic, something far more real, something infinitely more resilient, and perhaps in the end, something far, far more beautiful, was already quietly, courageously, and with an almost defiant, joyful exuberance beginning to bloom.